In this section, we'll look at the respiratory system. These important things to know with any anatomy and physiology, which is structure and function, is to know the function. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the respiratory system, and the quick version is it's breathing. The respiratory system is responsible for respiration, also known as ventilation, and in layman's terms, simply breathing. And the main gas that we need is oxygen, and the cells in our body need that oxygen in order to function. The breathing out is exhale, so we are getting rid of byproducts, and we breathe. The byproduct would be carbon dioxide, and when we breathe in, we're breathing in oxygen. Okay, gas exchange is what provides for oxygen, which is a gas, and carbon dioxide, which is a gas, to exchange between the blood and the air. Some other functions of the respiratory system, so that's one of them, gas exchange. Another one is communication. It allows for speech, so the air is forced up through the trachea, which is our windpipe, and passes through the vocal cords in order to produce sound. It's also responsible for smell. Okay, so olfaction is a fancy word for smell. That is actually cranial nerve 1. We have 12 pair of cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 1 is also known as the olfactory nerve. So that is what helps us smell. This is actually an interesting concept here. Smell is actually one of the functions of smell is defense. So it does help us to avoid danger. An example of that would be you can tell if something smells bad that, innately speaking, you're just going to avoid eating whatever is rotten. Okay, and smell is going to help you with that. All right, acid-base balances. So let's do a quick review of acid-base balance. All right, so you have 0. Okay, 0 all the way over to 14. And 0 represents acidic, and 14 would represent basic or alkaline. And the body likes to be around 7, which is neutral. Okay, so if you have too much, you have an increase in CO2, you're going to work your way toward acidity. And if you have too much oxygen, you're going to work your way toward alkaline or basic. Okay, so the body does a pretty good job of an acid-base balance to have a good ratio of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay, so too much CO2 will make you acidic. Too much oxygen will make you alkaline or basic. Okay, so hypoventilation. Okay, hypoventilation, which means you're not breathing enough, you'll become too acidic. And hyperventilation, which means you're breathing too much, is going to increase too much oxygen and will make you more alkaline or basic. Okay, keep in mind that if left unregulated, the human body would choose to be acidic. Okay, if left unregulated, the human body would choose to be acidic. So as a result, we have built-in buffering systems. Okay, a buffer is what resists acidity. So our kidneys are a buffer, our respiratory system is a buffer, blood itself, there's different components within blood that is a buffer to acidity. Okay, so our body does spend a lot of time keeping us relatively neutral, okay, resisting acidity. Uh, Respiratory system also helps with blood pressure regulation because of the angiotensin 2. The lungs actually release ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, that converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, that helps regulate blood pressure. Okay, I talked about that when we did the endocrine system a few weeks ago. Okay, platelet production. So the lungs, surprisingly, are responsible for the platelets, and they help to mature them. Okay, so if a person has a platelet problem, then one of the things that you would want to look at is the lungs. Okay, blood and lymph flow. Okay, breathing creates pressure gradients that allows circulation, which the three major tubes in the body are arteries, veins, and our lymphatic vessels. Okay, lymphatic vessels actually behave like veins. They work their way toward the heart. They have one-way valves, and breathing helps with that circulation and lymph and venous flow. The lungs also help with blood filtration. So the lungs do filter out small blood clots from the bloodstream and dissolve them. And then you have expulsion of abdominal contents. So breath holding and abdominal contraction help to expel abdominal contents during urination, defecation, and childbirth. Okay, let's look at the anatomy of the respiratory system. Okay, the body is broken down into upper and lower respiratory system. Okay, and the dividing line is about the throat area. Okay, so everything above this line is considered the upper respiratory tract, and everything below the line is considered the lower respiratory tract. So when you hear things like upper respiratory tract infection or lower respiratory tract infection, what exactly does that mean? Well, the answer is depends on if you know the anatomy. Okay, so everything above the throat, upper respiratory tract, everything below the throat, lower respiratory tract. Okay, let's get into some of the anatomy here. Okay, so we have the nasal cavity. Okay, the nasal cavity is all of this. There are turbinates inside of there. The purpose of it is to increase surface area to warm the air before it hits the lung. So one of the best methods of breathing is nasal breathing. Okay, you have the nostrils, so the opening to the nose. The hard palate, so inside the roof of the mouth. Okay, inside the roof of the mouth. So you open the mouth and look at the roof. That is the hard palate. And then as you work your way posterior, you're going to come across the soft palate. Okay, so hard palate, and then as you go more posterior, you come across a soft palate and the uvula. Okay, so when you open your mouth, when you look in the back of the throat and you see that thing hanging down, that's the uvula. Okay, the pharynx is the back of the throat, and so this is the trachea. Okay, so this is your windpipe, and behind the trachea is the esophagus. Okay, so that is our food tube. So when we swallow, we want food to get routed down the esophagus, so the food tube, not the trachea. So the epiglottis will cover the trachea to prevent food and water from going down your windpipe. Okay, so the trachea is the windpipe. Okay, as we work our way inferior, you're eventually going to come to the right and left lung. Okay, and the lungs are surrounded by a pleural cavity, which we'll talk about that later on. Okay, the nose has several functions, one of which includes to warm and cleanse and humidify the air that you breathe in. It can also detect odors, and it serves as a resonant chamber that helps you amplify your voice. So if you've ever had like a nasal or sinus infection, you can tell you kind of sound funny. It's because of the inflammation and the swelling that's inside. The air isn't quite resonating properly, so that's one of the reasons why you sound funny if you're sick with upper respiratory infection. Okay, the nostrils, also known as nares, are the openings, a pair of openings, and it goes back into what we have as concha. Okay, you have a superior, middle, and inferior concha, and what that does is it increases surface area to warm, cleanse, and humidify the air before it hits the lungs. So this is why nasal breathing is important. Even when we sleep, nasal breathing is very important. It's not the best to breathe through the mouth. It's best to breathe through the nose. Okay, the nose is made of cartilage. And then once you get past the cartilage, then you're going to expose the bony part. Okay, the vomer bone that's inside, the nasal bone, and the concha, which are actually these bony projections out of the inside of the nose there. Okay, the nose does have a septum. Septum means wall. So some people have a deviated septum, some people have a hole in their septum. The septum is an extension of the vomer bone, and the septum is made of cartilage. Okay, a closer up look of the anatomy. We have the nasal concha, and we have three of them, and they're named after locations. So the superior, the middle, and the inferior nasal concha. Okay, so that's this area. And then in between the superior, middle, and inferior concha, you have a meatus. And you have three of those. Okay, a superior, middle, and inferior meatus. Okay, the tongue, which is a muscle, is one of its responsibilities is to help coordinate the chewing of food, helps with speech. Okay, and it is a muscle, so it's also going to assist in the swallowing action. Okay, on this lateral view, you can see that if you were to chew food, it's supposed to be routed down the esophagus. All right, so that's your food tube, and that epiglottis is going to close off the trachea to prevent food and fluid from going down the trachea. Okay, the uvula, operated by cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve. This is a passageway out the nose. So if something happens and you swallow fluid, drink funny, it is possible to get water like up and out the nose. Okay, so the epiglottis covers the trachea on swallowing, and the uvula, this will actually close off to try to prevent fluid from going up, food and fluid going up and out the nose. Okay, so that's a reflex to have that soft palate close off that passageway. Okay, the auditory tube, also known as the eustachian tube, does actually drain into the back of the throat. So that goes from the ear down and it drains in to the back of the throat. So it is possible to have some sort of infection or fluid accumulation, and that fluid starts to do what's considered postnasal drip and constantly leak fluid into the back of the throat. Okay, here's our tonsils, right? So that's the palatine tonsil, the lingual tonsil. So when you open your mouth and say ah, chances are you're going to get a nice view of the palatine tonsils. So that's part of our immune system. So part of our defense. Okay, the pharynx is further divided into three parts. You have the nasopharynx, so it's going to be more behind the nose area. You have the oropharynx, so if you said ah and went straight back to the throat, that's the oropharynx. And then you have the laryngopharynx, okay, essentially the lower throat area. When you have a nasal culture done, so it's a really long, sterile Q-tip, if you will. As far as technique, you go straight back and you get a culture of the nasopharynx. Okay, you do not go up, you go straight back. And when you say ah, and you can look at the back of the throat, you can take that sterile Q-tip and rub the cotton on the back of the throat, so that would be the oropharynx area. And the whole purpose is if you suspect a person has some sort of illness, you're taking a culture on purpose to send it to the lab to look for whatever species, whether it's bacteria or viral. So that's the purpose of these particular cultures. Okay, the respiratory system does need a mucosal lining. Okay, so it's very important that the tubes in our body have a mucosal lining. So your digestive tubes, so large and small intestine, the trachea, the esophagus, and all the other tubes inside of us need that mucosal layer. One of the things that it does is it's protective. Okay, the trachea is also ciliated. Okay, ciliated means it has these little hair-like projections, and it's the purpose of cilia is to move foreign particles away from the lung field. So it will move foreign particles from the lung field up into the throat area. Okay, now the type of tissue is pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So pseudo means false. So it has a false appearance of stratified, which means multiple layers of cells stacked on each other. So it means it's, it has a thick appearance to it. And it's shaped like a column. Okay, so that's where we get columnar from. So it's ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium is the type of tissue that lines the trachea. All right, goblet cells are what make our mucosa, the mucus. Okay, so mucus comes from goblet cells, and you have goblet cells all over your body. Very important for that protective mucosal layer. Larynx area, there's a lot of cartilage in the larynx area, including the thyroid cartilage. Okay, this is the so-called Adam's apple. And so males and females have this, although in males it is more prominent and more obvious, but males and females both have this thyroid cartilage. Okay, here's the hyoid bone. So there's a lot of muscles that do attach to the hyoid bone, like the thyrohyoid, the omohyoid, and so on. There's a bunch of them. A lot of those are going to assist with swallowing. Okay, here's the cricoid cartilage. It's right here. And of course, superior to that is the thyroid cartilage. Now, as far as anatomy is concerned, this is an important area because of a tracheotomy, also known as simply a trach. So if a person is trached, they are going to go in between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. And these are things that you can palpate. So healthcare providers, especially those that work in hospitals, have to know this anatomy in order to help people that have a trach. The tracheal cartilage also are made of hyaline. Okay, so these are hyaline cartilage, and which makes these not collapsible. Okay, so if you were to squeeze a trachea, it would just open right back up. The tube would open back up to where it came from. All right, the vestibular fold and the vocal cords. So anyone who has laryngitis, right, so inflammation of the larynx, is going to lose their voice, okay, because this is the voice box area. The fancy word for sound production is called phonation. And air comes up from the lungs and goes through the vocal cords to give us our sound. So if they're all inflamed or laryngitis, you either can't talk because you're hoarse or you sound funny. Okay. Okay, here is a view of the larynx area where you can see the vocal cords. Okay, right now it's open. And so this is a camera that they put in the mouth, and they're working its way down into the throat area. So this is a picture of what the glottis, the trachea, so the opening to the windpipe, and you can even see the hyaline cartilaginous rings there, and the vocal cords that pass over the trachea, because air is going to be forced up and out, and it's going to make the vocal cords vibrate and produce sound. Okay, as you stick the camera further down into the trachea, eventually that trachea actually bifurcates. So you have a right and left primary bronchi, also known as the main bronchi. Okay, so the trachea tube does split into the right and left main bronchi, also known as the right and left primary bronchi. Okay, the trachea, also known as the windpipe in layman's terms, is about 12 centimeters long and about 1 inch in diameter. And it is kept open by those C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings. Okay, you can see as the trachea is, as we go inferior, eventually it will split into the right and left primary bronchi. Okay, now it depends on the book that you read. Some authors say the right and left main bronchi. Some say right and left primary bronchi. Me personally, I like the primary bronchi because then it turns into the secondary bronchi and then turns into the tertiary bronchi and then the terminal ends. Okay, one way you can tell right versus left is the right primary bronchi is going to be more vertical and the left is going to have a little bit more of an oblique position to it because of the heart. Okay, so the heart does favor the center of the chest to the left, so it's going to displace the left primary bronchi. And so that means that if a person is going to choke on something, chances are it's going to favor the right side, taking the path of least resistance. Now, can the left side have something stuck in it? Absolutely. You can definitely get stuff stuck in the left lung, but the odds are it's going to go into the right lung because it's more vertical. Okay, the primary bronchi then bifurcate or split into the secondary bronchi, also known as the lobar bronchi, and then those will split again into tertiary, okay, or the segmental bronchi. Okay, here is a superior view, and you can see the cilia. All right, all those little hair-like projections are the cilia. Okay, lumen, when you look down the barrel of any tube, you're looking down the lumen. Okay, so the trachea is a tube, and all of that is the lumen. Okay, we have our mucosal layer and the mucus glands that help the goblet cells to produce the mucus. Okay, there's a goblet cell, and there's the cilia. And the cilia is going to move debris and particles away from the lung field, from the lungs to the throat. And you're either going to swallow it, which the stomach acid will kill anything that's trapped in there. And if you're symptomatic, then you're going to spit up these phlegm things. Okay, so that's what comes up from the chest area, away from the lung field. Okay, so the right versus left lung, there is a difference in anatomy. Okay, the right lung, so this is the right side, this is the left side. The right lung has 1, 2, 3 lobes, and the left lung only has 2 lobes. So that means they are separated by a fissure. On the right side, this is the horizontal fissure because it's in the horizontal plane, also known as the transverse plane. And then we have another fissure that's diagonal. Of course, the fancy word for diagonal is oblique in the anatomy world. So we have the horizontal fissure and the oblique fissure, and that separates those lungs into the 3 lobes, simply named after location: superior lobe, middle lobe, and inferior lobe. Okay, on the left side, it only has 2 lobes, which means 1 fissure that's shaped diagonally. So the fancy word is oblique. Okay, so the left lung has only the oblique fissure separating it into the superior lobe and inferior lobe. All right, where the heart makes an indentation into the left lung, that's called a cardiac impression. Okay, apex and base. Okay, remember, apex is anything that comes to a point, and a base that is anything that is broad and flat. So the apex of the lungs are the superior aspect, and the base of the lungs is the inferior aspect. Okay, you can see that here, there's the base of the lungs. And oddly enough, the diaphragm is also going to be in that area of that green line. Okay, when you look at the medial side of the lungs, you'll see a lot of tubes going in and out of the lungs. So that area is called the hilus, or the hilum of the lungs, and that translates to root pluck. Okay, so there's the hilum, and this is where all the tubes are coming in and out of the lungs. Okay, and that's simply that area. Okay, the bronchial tree has about 65,000 terminal bronchioles. Okay, so these are tubes that begin essentially in the trachea area, and they work their way all the way to the end. Okay, so some of the tubes in there are called the bronchioles. And this one shows the AKAs, right? So you have the right main bronchi, also known as primary. And then you have the inferior lobar, also known as secondary bronchi. And then you have the segmental bronchi, also known as the tertiary. So primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi. Okay, so you have 10 segmental or the tertiary bronchi on the right lung and 8 on the left lung. Okay, a lot of the lung is smooth muscle, and that allows those tubes to contract or relax or constrict and dilate the area. So you can have a nice big open tube or a constricted tube, right? So bronchial dilation bronchial constriction. When you start to exercise, you're going to need better gas exchange, so the bronchioles will dilate, so they'll open up. And if you're in a relaxed state, then the bronchioles will go from dilated to a more constricted. Now, if they overconstrict, now we've got breathing problems. Once we get to the terminal ends in the bronchial area, okay, so if you go in order, it would be the nasal cavity, then the pharynx, then the trachea, and this would be oxygen entering into the lungs. So pretend you're an oxygen molecule. What structures are you passing through from beginning to end? Okay, nasal cavity, pharynx, trachea. The main bronchus or primary, secondary, tertiary bronchus, then the bronchioles, and then the terminal bronchial branches. And then at the end of that, you're going to find the alveoli. Okay, this is the site of actual gas exchange. Okay, so gas exchange, the respiratory bronchiole, the alveolar duct, the atrium, and the alveoli itself. All right, so each human lung has about 480 million little sacs of the alveoli. Okay, these provide about 70 meters squared of gas exchange surface per lung, which is equal to about the floor area of an American indoor handball court or a room that's about 25 square feet. Okay, that's pretty impressive on putting all that increases surface area to really allow us to do a lot of gas exchange. Okay, when you're looking at the alveoli, so here is the terminal end, which means we're at the end of the tubes. All right, so you have the bronchiole and eventually the terminal bronchiole and the respiratory bronchiole, and then the cluster of grapes, okay, all the alveoli. Now, what surrounds each alveoli is a bunch of capillaries. These are the pulmonary capillaries. And their job is gas exchange. Okay, so we are, here's the blood. Here's our air sac. So the air that is inside, or the oxygen that's inside of the air sac or alveoli, needs to be transferred into the capillary system, which when you trace that away from the heart, the capillaries, because they're in the artery family, will taper into arterioles and eventually the arteries. Okay, so these are the smallest components, and very thin membrane. Okay, the respiratory membrane and the simple squamous epithelium that's in the respiratory membrane is thin enough to allow for gas exchange. Okay, the squamous, so simple squamous epithelium means it's one cell layer thin. So it's very thin, and gases like to diffuse easily along very thin tissue, right? So gas exchange does very well with thin tissue. So there's your simple squamous alveoli. Okay, inside of an alveoli, we're going to have a defense system. Okay, so that defense system is a macrophage, also known as a dust cell. Okay, so a macrophage that's inside of the alveoli is called a dust cell. and its job is to go around and eat the bad guys. As you can imagine, air quality is not that very good no matter where you're at. Okay, you're always breathing in particles, you're always breathing in, harmful things, and so you rely heavily on your, in this case, the respiratory system to um, to have your Pac-Mans, right? Those built-in Pac-Mans, the macrophage, go in and kill all those things. Okay, also, it's important that we have a surfactant, which is a detergent fluid-like material. So it's a fluid. It's very important to have this surfactant. And that's going to help with the way the alveoli, their surface tension. Okay, so squamous type 1 or alveolar cells type 1 versus the type 2 alveolar cells. Okay, the type 1 alveolar cells are what actually allow for gas exchange. And the type 2 alveolar cells are what release the surfactant. Okay, the pulmonary surfactant. So it's a mixture of phospholipids, so fat and protein, and it prevents the bronchioles from collapsing on exhale. Okay, there's the macrophages that are also known as the dust cells. Okay, so those are the Pac-Mans that go around and phagocytize, which means it eats the bad guys. Any kind of debris or anything that doesn't belong there.